My boss blocked my flight for a $5 million deal. So I got revenge. I had spent months preparing for this deal. Every detail, every number, every possible question the investors might ask. I had rehearsed it all in my head 1,000 times over. $5 million was on the line, and if we landed it, it wouldn't just be the biggest deal of my career, it would cement my reputation as someone who could take this company to the next level. But none of that mattered because I never even made it to the meeting. The problem? Meredith Crane. My boss. My roadblock. The one person standing between me and the flight that should have taken me to San Francisco, where our potential partners were waiting. I'd worked under Meredith for 3 years, long enough to understand that she operated on control. She liked things done her way, and if they weren't, she'd find a way to remind you who held the power. That week, I was the target of her little game. It started 2 days before I was supposed to leave. I checked my email, expecting to see the confirmation for my flight, standard company procedure. Except it wasn't there. I refreshed. Nothing. I checked my spam folder. Still nothing. I reached out to our travel coordinator, who told me they hadn't been authorized to book my ticket. Meredith had put the brakes on it and no one knew why. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a miscommunication. I went to her office, ready to clear it up, but the moment I stepped inside, I saw it in her expression. That tight, knowing smile. She wanted me to ask. She wanted me to squirm. Corporate's reevaluating travel expenses, she said, casual, like she wasn't single-handedly torching the most important deal I had ever worked on. We have to be mindful of our budget. Budget? This was a $5 million deal. The flight wasn't an expense, it was an investment. I pointed that out. She waved it off. I'll handle it, she said. I knew what that meant. I knew how she operated. She wanted this deal under her name, wanted the glory, the recognition. It didn't matter that I had built the relationships, that I had spent months negotiating terms, sending reports, making sure every last number was perfect. In her eyes, I was just another stepping stone. I could have fought back. I could have gone to the CEO, made my case. But that would have meant war, and Meredith had spent years solidifying her position in the company. I had no illusions about how this would play out. If I stepped out of line, she'd make sure I paid for it. Still, I couldn't just let it go. I needed to get to San Francisco. I had worked too hard to watch it slip through my fingers because of office politics. I scrambled for options. I looked at last-minute flights, but the prices were sky-high, and I couldn't justify paying out of pocket. I reached out to a few contacts, hoping for a corporate favor, but nothing came through. The hours ticked by, and with every passing minute, the weight of it settled deeper in my chest. The night before the meeting, I sat in my apartment, staring at my suitcase. It was packed. I had been so sure I was going. But I wasn't. I was stuck here, and there was nothing I could do about it. The next morning, I woke up to an email. Meredith had gone in my place. She had taken my pitch, my work, my deal, and flown to San Francisco like it had been hers all along. And then, 2 hours later, another email. The deal had fallen through. I stared at the screen, rereading the words over and over. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Rage, frustration, and, somewhere deep down, a flicker of satisfaction. Meredith had gone in thinking she could handle it. She had thought that my months of work, my carefully built relationships, were just numbers on a spreadsheet. But deals like this weren't just about numbers. They were about trust. And the investors had seen right through her. But the damage was done. The deal was lost, the company had taken a hit, and I knew exactly what was coming next. Meredith wasn't the kind of person who took responsibility. She would need someone to blame. And I had a feeling I already knew who that someone was going to be. I had barely processed the failure of the deal before the fallout began. Meredith wasted no time in shifting the blame, crafting a narrative that conveniently left out her own arrogance and incompetence. The first sign came in the form of a company-wide email, one of those carefully worded messages that said a lot without really saying anything. Due to unforeseen complications, our negotiations in San Francisco did not yield the desired outcome. Moving forward, we will be reassessing our approach to high-value deals. No mention of why. No mention of her own decision to cut me out of the process. Just a vague, sweeping statement meant to bury the truth under corporate jargon. Then came the one-on-one meetings. I was called into a conference room on the executive floor, the kind with polished wood tables and walls lined with framed photos of past successes. Meredith sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. Across from her, our CEO, Douglas Carmichael, leaned back in his chair, watching the room with the measured silence of a man who had heard too many excuses in his career. Meredith spoke first, listing off a series of reasons why the deal had crumbled. She claimed the investors had been uneasy about our long-term projections, that our pitch had lacked agility in response to changing market dynamics. She threw around enough buzzwords to make it sound like an inevitability rather than a direct result of her miscalculation. I sat there, listening, waiting, knowing exactly where this was going. And then, the pivot. There was a lack of alignment between the initial negotiations and the final proposal, she said, her gaze flickering toward me just long enough to make her point. Perhaps if there had been more internal consistency, we could have presented a stronger case. There it was, the subtle accusation, the implication that the failure stemmed from my work, my strategy, my approach. She hadn't outright said it was my fault. No, that would have been too obvious. Instead, she planted the seed, letting it take root in the CEO's mind, letting doubt fester. Douglas turned to me. Do you have anything to add? I took a breath, forcing myself to stay composed. I could have laid it all out right then. How she had deliberately kept me off the flight, how she had hijacked my work without understanding the relationships behind it. But I knew how this worked. Calling out a superior in a meeting like this was a gamble, and Meredith had spent years cultivating her influence. If I made this personal, if I let my anger dictate my response, it would only backfire. So I chose my words carefully. I pointed out the timeline, the disruption in strategy, the last-minute change in personnel. I didn't attack her directly, but I made it clear that critical decisions had been made without my involvement, and that those decisions had consequences. I kept my voice steady, my tone professional. Douglas listened, nodded, and finally leaned forward. It's clear there were missteps. We need to ensure this doesn't happen again. His eyes moved between us. We'll reassess roles and responsibilities moving forward. Meredith, I trust you'll take the necessary steps to address these concerns. I knew what that meant. No reprimand, no consequences for her. Just another vague directive that would ultimately be twisted in her favor. When I left that room, I knew I was in trouble. Meredith wasn't just going to let this go. She had already failed in front of the company's leadership, and she would need someone to absorb the damage. The next few weeks were a slow unraveling. Tasks that had once been mine were reassigned. Emails I should have been copied on never made it to my inbox. Invitations to key meetings mysteriously stopped coming. I was being pushed out, piece by piece, in a way that was almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. And then, the final blow. HR called me in for a routine review. The conversation started off with vague questions about my performance, my ability to work within the company's structure. And then the words came, "There have been concerns raised about your ability to effectively collaborate with leadership." It was a setup, a carefully orchestrated maneuver designed to discredit me just enough to make my position untenable. If I pushed back too hard, I would be labeled as difficult to work with. If I stayed quiet, I would be complicit in my own downfall. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at my laptop screen, running through every option. I could fight this. I could take it to HR, gather every piece of evidence, make a formal complaint. But I knew how these things went. Meredith had insulated herself too well, played the game for too long. The odds were against me. But then, something shifted. A different thought entered my mind. Maybe I didn't need to fight her on her terms. Maybe there was another way. If she wanted to push me out, fine. But I wasn't going to go quietly. I wasn't going to let Meredith dictate the end of my career. If she thought she could quietly erase me, she was wrong. I wasn't just some disposable employee she could cast aside when it suited her. I had spent years building my reputation, forging relationships, and proving my worth. And I still had one thing she didn't: respect from the people who mattered. I started by reaching out to the investors we had lost. Not formally, not through company channels, but directly. I sent emails, made phone calls, apologized for the failed negotiations, and subtly probed for details on what had gone wrong. As expected, their reasons had little to do with market conditions or misalignment, as Meredith had claimed. It was about trust. They had felt blindsided by the sudden change in personnel. They had built a rapport with me, and when Meredith had shown up in my place, it had sent a message that our company wasn't reliable, that we didn't value consistency. I documented everything, every response, every comment, every indication that the deal had been salvageable if not for her interference. I compiled a report cross-referencing my original strategy with what had actually been presented in San Francisco. And then, when I had everything I needed, I went straight to Douglas Carmichael. Unlike my last meeting with him, this time I didn't hold back. I laid it all out: how I had been kept from attending, how Meredith had hijacked the deal, how she had deflected responsibility when it failed. I presented the investor feedback, showing in their own words that trust had been the deciding factor. I made it clear that if the company wanted to succeed in landing future deals, it couldn't afford leadership that put personal ambition above corporate success. For the first time since this ordeal had begun, I saw a shift in Douglas's expression. He wasn't a man who made rash decisions, but he valued results. And the numbers didn't lie. The board couldn't ignore a $5 million failure, especially when there was evidence that it had been preventable. A week later, an internal memo went out. Meredith was being reassigned to a less critical role, her decision-making authority significantly reduced. It wasn't an outright dismissal. Companies rarely handled executives that way, but it was a clear demotion. Word spread quickly, and for the first time in years, people weren't afraid to talk about her missteps. She had lost her power, and with it, her ability to manipulate the people around her. As for me, I was offered the chance to rebuild. Douglas gave me a new project, another high-stakes deal, but this time with full control. No interference, no politics, just an opportunity to prove what I could do. It wasn't just about redemption, it was about reclaiming what was mine. I took that deal and ran with it. I worked harder than I ever had, refining every detail, making sure that nothing was left to chance. And this time, when I stepped onto that plane, there was no last-minute sabotage, no sudden changes. I walked into that meeting room in New York with confidence, knowing that I had earned my place there. 3 months later, the contract was signed. $6 million. Bigger than the deal we had lost, and more importantly, proof that I was indispensable. Meredith never spoke to me again after her reassignment. She kept to herself, a shadow of the force she had once been. And I didn't need her to say anything. Her silence was all the acknowledgement I needed. Looking back, I don't regret how it all played out. I had been tested, pushed to the edge, but I had come out stronger. I had learned that office politics could be brutal, that power wasn't always in the hands of those who deserved it. But I had also learned that integrity mattered, that persistence could pay off. And in the end, I hadn't just won back my career. I had built something even greater.